Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and I'd like to thank the conference organizers for having me here today. Um, Today, I'm going to talk about the economics of a up-and-coming feature on blockchains and sequencers called revert protection. And this is joint work with Shin from Uniswap, Siama from Columbia and Paradigm, Dan from Paradigm, and Brad from Uniswap Labs. So I think most people here are familiar with this. So I'll just go through it fairly quickly. So on DeFi applications, users are interacting with smart contracts via atomic transactions. And for each transaction, a user is charged a fee called a gas fee that can be split into a base fee and a priority fee. And now these transactions can have state contingencies built within them. For example, if we are trading on a automated market maker, there's set slippage tolerances. And if these state contingencies or conditions are not met, then the smart contract will revert the transactions, basically causing it to fail. So these reverted transactions fail, are not fully executed, but the user is still charged some sort of gas fee based on how far down into the transaction they went before the revert was triggered. So, for example, on automated market makers, the gas fee reverted transactions is about 10 to 20% of the gas fee of a successful transaction. So now, revert protection basically is where block builders or sequencers exclude these failing transactions completely from the final block. So in this case, the reverted transaction is not executed at all. So in this case, the user pays no fee as opposed to a percentage of a fee on some chain that does not have revert protection. And the main challenge of this for block builders and sequencers is that they sort of need to figure out which transactions will fit based on simulation. So there's a variety of settings in which revert protection can potentially be relevant. One such setting is bundle auctions on layer 1 chains such as the Ethereum mainnet. So here, this is where searchers submit bundles of transactions and bid to have their bundles included by the block. And these bids can be expressed via a priority fee or a coin-based transfer. And this last point matters because for coin-based transfers, the priority fee is only paid upon a successful transaction. Now, another couple of settings in which revert protection can be relevant is on sequencers with that use priority ordering rules. So layer 2 sequencers are more algorithmic in their inclusion and ordering. Instead of bidding for inclusion, they sort of algorithmically include and order transactions, for example, by first come, first serve, or in our case of interest, by priority fee bids. And there's another up and coming feature called MEV taxes that basically allow applications to capture and split MEV between the sequencer and application with a tax on the priority fee. So this again is only paid if the transaction is successful. So within these settings, we can basically isolate many number of settings in which revert protection can possibly be applied. So traditionally in L1 with priority fees and L2 with priority ordering, there are some penalty fees for reverted transactions on both the base and gas fee. However, if you use coin-based transfers or in apps using MEV taxes, the rest of basically the priority fee is not paid, only the base fee is. And then naturally in applications or settings with full revert protection, neither the base gas or priority fee are paid, or a portion of it if the transaction fails. So given this variety of settings, one thing that this work does is we introduce a novel and unified model to analyze the economics of revert protections that could be applied to all of the above settings mentioned, and we are able to solve for closed form equilibria within these settings. And our main takeaways is that revert protection offers better auction revenue, more efficient block space usage, and in the context of automated market making, we show that basically revert protection can improve market efficiency and price discovery. Finally, we provide potential solutions to address the computational costs of implementing revert protection, which, as I mentioned before, had to deal with having the block builders or sequencers simulate all the potential transactions to figure out which ones fail. So just to go over some related literature to what we're doing, there's some previous works on block building auctions in L1 networks that deal with interesting features such as private mempools, proposer builder separation, as well as integrated searcher builders, as well as some features of L2 networks such as first come, first serve, transaction ordering, and shared sequencing. So this paper provides the novel analysis of a new feature or up and coming feature of revert protection on settings in both L1 and L2 networks. And the second part is the model that we use is basically some variant of an all-pay auction. And this is an object studied frequently in the traditional economics literature. And how our paper is different relevant to this is we consider basically differential partial refunds in our setting, refunds on the base gas fee and priority gas fee, as well as a larger set of strategy spaces for the users. So now let's get right into our model. So we have end users bidding for a MEV opportunity with value V, and we assume that this value V is common knowledge to everyone, all the users, as opposed to other settings in which users might have private values on the MEV opportunity. So common value MEV opportunities could be, for example, arbitrage between centralized and decentralized exchanges, as well as liquidations and lending protocols. So for a strategy space, we say that each user can either abstain from the auction or join and bid a priority fee of BI. So upon participating, you already have to pay the base gas fee G. So if you win, you need to pay G plus BI. But if you lose, your transaction is reverted and you need to pay R1 times G and R2 plus R2 times BI, where R1 and R2 are sort of the revert cost penalty rates on the base gas fee and priority fee, respectively. And as going along with the running example of AMMs, typically R1 and R2 we can represent as between 0.1 and 0.2. Okay, so to sort of show how our previous settings now translate to our model, whenever we have a partial in these columns, you can think of it as R1 or R2 between 0 and 1. And whenever there's a no, you can basically write R1 or R2 as 0. So we want to look for equilibrium among the users in terms of mixed strategies. And specifically, each user chooses a randomized strategy based on PI, which is the probability that they don't participate in the auction, plus FI, which is the specific distribution of the priority fee bid that the user bids according to. So with this, we can rewrite our payoffs for each user conditional on bidding BI and giving the other people's bids as this. Now, the win probability is given by an expression where you want all the other users to either abstain or participate and bid something lower than your current. So taking the expected value of this over the entire possible range of bid values, we can write users' expected payoffs according to this. So because we're considering a mixed strategy equilibrium, the user needs to be indifferent between all possible choices of what to bid, as well as not participating at all. So this naturally leads to zero payoff condition, where your payoff from winning the auction is equal to the payoff from not winning the auction. And eventually, you can sort of solve this and applying some boundary conditions to get closed form expressions for this auction equilibrium. Okay, so now that we've solved for these equilibrium, let's sort of analyze some main takeaways we have for sequencer design based off of this. So our first main result is we can split the total revenue accrued from the auction into two components. So here we have our total revenue, and here we have it split into two components. So the first component is the revenue just made off from the base fees, as well as the reverted base fees. And the second component is made up of the priority fee as well as the reverted priority fees. Now, one interesting observation you can make on the total revenue is to note that it does not depend on R2, which in our model is sort of the penalty rate you have on the priority fee. In terms of the revert protection rates, the main variable of interest is R1, which is the revert penalty rate on the base gas fee. And we'll digest this a little more in the next slide. And the second result is if you look at this expression, you notice that the revenue is decreasing in R1. So as R1 increases, your revenue decreases, which means that the optimal amount of revenue is attained when R1 is equal to 0. This is when you're not paying any additional gas fee for reverted transactions at all. So why is this the case? So because the equilibrium payoff of each user is 0, their total combined one is also 0. So if no one decides to participate, then the auctioneer makes 0 revenue. However, if at least one person participates, they make a revenue of Z. So we can basically rewrite the expected revenue as the expected probability that this MEV opportunity is contested. So we have this formula right here. And now as we analyze this equilibrium in terms of the revert penalty rates, R1 and R2, we find two main trade-offs. So if you make the penalties less for reverting transactions, then first of all, you get less revenue generated from these reverted transactions. But on the other hand, users are more incentivized to participate and also bid more aggressively as well. So basically, in this equilibrium, the increased user participation and more aggressive bidding outweighs the decreased revenue earned from not having any revenue accrued from reverted transactions. And the reason why the revenue does not depend on R2 is basically you can think of there's going to be some participant that decides to participate but does not bid at all. So for them, they only need to focus on the revert penalties of participation, not extra priority fees. In this case, it's just R1. And something interesting happens when we take n to infinity. We find that the revenue converges to some finite limit. Some implications for DeFi is that when this MEV opportunity represents some type of arbitrage, then this term right here, 1 minus p started is the probability that this arbitrage opportunity is exploited by some user. So as R1 decreases, we can say that these arbitrage opportunities are exploited more frequently, which in turn implies better price discovery and market efficiency. Now, another aspect of this is to consider the block space and mempool usage metrics. So the first main finding that there's one transaction in the final block sort of follows naturally because by definition, the block builder or sequencer is tossing out all of the transactions that would revert, the ones that do not win the opportunity. But there are multiple transactions in the final block if you don't have revert protection. However, when you look at transactions submitted to the memory pool, we find that they are higher under revert protection because there's basically no disincentive of submitting. And specifically, this does not converge as n goes to infinity, so this diverges. So when there are a lot of agents, you have finite revenue, but potentially a lot of storage and spam on the memory pool. So given this, and one thing that we didn't really touch upon in the baseline model are the costs of revert protection. And namely, the sequencer must simulate the blocks to find out which ones revert. And this results in a lot of computational costs for the sequencer. We assume that these are negligible so far, but now let's assume that there's a cost C per transaction submitted. Now there's two things that sequencers can do to sort of address these issues and prevent spam in the mempool. The first one is to basically internalize the costs themselves. The second one is to pass the costs on to users. So let's consider the trade-offs of each scheme. So in the first scheme, where sequencers internalize the cost themselves, there's no disincentive to user participation, but they have to cover the cost themselves, which comes out of their final revenue and profit. Second scheme, where the users pay this time a flat fee instead of a proportional penalty fee to cover the costs. Well, there's no cost to the sequencer, but this could disincentivize user participation. So when we consider each of these schemes and recompute the equilibrium for the auction, we find that under the first scheme, where the sequencer is covering the costs themselves, there are some non-zero profit optimal values of R1 and R2. But still under the second scheme, the profit optimal values are 0. And the second issue is that the profit under the second scheme, where users pay a flat fee, is greater than that under the first scheme, where the sequencer covers the costs for small enough computational costs. So the design implications of this is that, well, for the first scheme, if you want to have the optimal amount of revenue, you have to dynamically adjust your R1 and R2 based on the other parameters. And, well, under the second scheme, there's no proportional penalty. So this is more in the nature of revert protection, where you're saying your penalty for reverting transaction is not proportional based on your bid or your gas fee, but rather just a simple flat fee. Now, looking into some future directions, we find the main question associated with implementing revert protection is, how do sequencers balance the benefits of this with the risks from mempool spam or spikes in demand, where you have a lot of transactions in the mempool in a short amount of time? For example, when prices are very volatile. So some potential future directions can include convex costs. So instead of having the computational cost be modeled as a constant C per transaction, we have some convex function of it, which sort of captures like when sequencers are under a lot of demand, they probably have to do more than proportional amount of cost to manage all of this. Rate limiting, which basically limits the amounts of revert per users, and dynamic pricing for the flat fee. So if you're given a fixed cost C, as we do in the model, instead of basically the sequencer can choose another flat fee like C1 or C2 to charge to the users for that. So this concludes my talk for today, and I'd be glad to take any questions.
Okay, thanks for the talk. So it's a very interesting work. One thing I would be curious about is to know whether the mixed strategy is the unique equilibrium, and also about the stability of the mixed strategy.
So for uniqueness, I believe we show that if basically there's some uniqueness results in the full paper, but this is essentially unique. We find that there does not exist any pure strategy equilibrium. So next thing is to mixed, and within the class of mixed strategy equilibrium, this is unique.
Okay, very nice.
And can I ask more about your stability notion? Or?
If it's unique, so stability, so is there in the paper a check of the stability?
What notions of stability are you thinking?
If it was small perturbation of the belief, the best response point toward the equilibrium.
don't think we've looked at that.
Okay, so that would be, I think, a nice thing to consider.
Yeah,
But
thank you.
very nice. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I also enjoyed it a lot. Just to give me a little bit of a reference for the costs for a reverted transaction for a sequencer, how much is this super roughly? I know it will depend on implementations and so on, but how much is it? Is it 1/10 of a cent or 1/1000 of a cent?
The cost for reverting a transaction in a sequencer?
Yes, you were saying that a sequencer still bears the cost or internalizes the cost for a reverted transaction
like
that
the-
they are not mining. But then how much is that, just very roughly?
I'm not too familiar with this, but maybe you can ask one of my co-authors who may know a little bit more about what it is on the sequencer.
We have time for 2-3 more questions. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand.
Over there.
So I like the theory a lot, and I don't normally do this, but I want to ask more about the practice side. Because I'm just curious about the ways this could be abused with, if I can submit transactions that force you to do lots and lots of simulations, right? Because maybe the first time you do the simulation, there's a reversion here, but then you take it out, or like if you put it earlier, there's no reversion. So I'm very curious about that aspect. I know it's maybe not directly related to the paper, which seemed really nice, but I'm just curious to hear about that.
Yeah, so that's a great aspect that you bring up. And I believe like in practice, one of the main issues that sequencers considering implementing revert protection now is how to deal with the potential spam or abuse by like the users that you mentioned. And within this, typically some of the main proposed action items are to either impose rate limits for users, so you can only sort of have this many reverted transactions within some given period. Another possible thing is to do like dynamic or surge pricing. So like you, instead of making the cost proportional to your base and priority fee bids, you just offer a flat fee, but you can maybe change this flat fee when demand is like very high on your sequence. But yeah, that's a great issue that you bring up in terms of revert protection.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, I have a quick comment. So you don't actually have to try different orderings of transactions. You can order them once by priority, and then basically as you go, if a transaction gets reverted, you throw it away, and then you proceed. So basically there is no need to reshuffle anything. That's a comment on the previous question. But to your paper in general, I think so you're saying that liquidity get arbitraged more, and so this leads to a more efficient market, and at the same time to higher revenue for the sequencer. And so I think these two things are at odds with each other. If you arbitrage more, then the revenue of sequencer decreases, just because we know that if block times decrease, then LVR goes down. If you have more frequent auctions, you make less money. So in your paper, you have a static model where if an arbitrage opportunity is not taken, it goes away. But in a dynamic model, I think you would pretty much find that market efficiency increases, as you say. But I have a feeling that the sequencer makes less money. So it would be nice to know how this result would extend to a dynamic model where arbitrage opportunities change over time.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that in this case, I was thinking of market efficiency as in like the market reflects all the available like sort of information. So typically like your price in like a liquidity pool is aligned to some price on a centralized exchange. So if you're just a static model for now, if this arbitrage opportunity is unrealized, then you have a misalignment between prices on these two exchanges, which I guess is not really efficient for this decentralized exchange. I think if we make this model dynamic and you impose some sort of law of motion on the price, then I think, yeah, you could always have a chance of like the centralized exchange price matching the decentralized exchange price that has been unexploited, but there's a chance that the gap can like further, there's some probability, I guess, at least in the language of the model, that the price gap can further diverge. But yeah, it'd be definitely interesting to consider how the market efficiency aspect of this would play out for a more dynamic model for multiple periods. Yeah. Thanks.
Let's thank the speaker.